Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of the webinar this morning is ethical governance in schools in 2020. Very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us at such an early hour of the day. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we begin the webinar this morning. If you're new to this platform, hopefully you've managed to actually locate the go-to toolbar. If you haven't, then there's a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it floating around somewhere in the top right hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, that will actually open the toolbar for you, and on the toolbar you'll see the little document icon, which does enable you to download the handout, which is a copy of all of the slides we're going to share with you this morning. You can do that now or at any stage during the webinar or immediately subsequent to the webinar finishing. It won't take you out of the webinar at all doing that. You'll also see the word questions in a little grey box and white copy on it. Anytime you'd like to ask a question, and we please do encourage you to do that, that's what makes these webinars interactive. Just type your question in and hit the send button, and that will actually appear in front of us, and we will do our level best to be able to respond to those for you. We have got a very large number of colleagues joining us today, so if we don't get to answer every single question, we will respond to you separately after the event, but as I say, we'll do our best to actually group common questions together. One last thing before we kick off, hopefully you can all see the little hand icon. If you can hear us and your sound's okay, if you could actually raise your hand just to indicate that now, we'd be very grateful. Lovely, and I can see lots of hands being put up now, which is great. Perfect. Okay, I'll just put your hands down for you because we can do that, and with no more ado, we'll actually kick off. So as I say, a very warm welcome to the webinar. My name is Steve Barker, and I'm the person on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning. Morning, Linda.
Good morning.
And between us, Linda and I will actually guide you through this session this morning and, as I say, answer your questions. So please do keep those questions and comments coming as we go through the content. The aims of today's session are first and foremost to ensure that everybody has some clarity of understanding of what we actually mean by this term ethical leadership, and obviously specifically as an element of that, ethical governance within the educational arena. We want to spend some time actually reflecting on how the concept of ethical governance should be applied in our schools and in our academies, not just now, but obviously moving forward. And last but by no means least, what we want to do is to hopefully provoke a little bit of thought amongst you to think about, well, what does best practice look like with regard to ethical governance and ethical leadership in schools, and where can we go for further support, further access in terms of additional resources, etc. But just to reiterate once more, this is your session, so please stop us and ask us questions or make comments as we're going along, and we'll do our best to respond to those. There's a bit of a pedant in me, I have to admit, and those of you that know me will be very well aware of this. So a good starting point for me is always to actually refer to the dictionary and what does the dictionary say about this term. And I think we're all very aware of what we mean by ethics, but perhaps in the context of our schools it might take on slightly different meaning. But for me, it's really important to look at the definition here, and we're talking about morality. We're talking about principles, we're talking about conduct, and if you're that interested, then the derivation of the word comes from Greek, of course. But ultimately, what we're saying here is that when we're talking about ethics or an ethical framework here, we're talking about morality. We're talking about being concerned with the truth, about that distinction between right and wrong. And hopefully we can all appreciate and understand how that sits within perhaps some of the decisions that school leaders, including us as governors, are called upon to make in the conduct of our roles in schools at this point in time and going forward. So that begs the question, well, why should ethical leadership, specifically ethical governance, be on our agenda in 2020? It's not new, it has to be said, and we'll spend some time just looking at development in a few moments. But I just wanted to pick out one or two headlines from very recent days and weeks, which I believe have an ethical, if not a moral, if not both dimension to them. story here in The Guardian Online from, I think this was about 10 days ago, talking about the fact that many head teachers still remain out of pocket because they've personally funded additional food, free school meals vouchers, etc., for pupils during the lockdown. And obviously there is an ethical dimension here. Free school meals scheme in terms of the vouchers, hard to use, say parents and head teachers, not a similar theme there, but that's coming at it from a parental hardship perspective. News item that was around the tail end of last week, one of the leading children's charities saying that shoes are being sent to some of the poorest spots in the UK, and there's been a very real spike during the coronavirus pandemic. We've just gone past the admissions round in schools, or not the admissions round, the outcome of the admissions round, I should say, in the last couple of months or so, and lots of parents are still very confused about what that means, what that does in terms of their rights and their entitlement to get their child a place where they lead. Now, something as important as that, hopefully most of us can appreciate there ought to be, yes, some kind of ethical stance that the system, if not individual schools, ought to be able to take. This was in yesterday's Telegraph Online, following the announcement of the pay award for teachers that's coming up. Headline itself: teachers who didn't rise to the challenge should give their pay rise to unsung carers. I'm not making any statement on that at all. I'm married to a teacher, so you can probably understand where I'm coming from on a personal level, but what does that do to the profession? What does that do to the perception of our schools? And actually, isn't there something about doing the right thing here? Should be one more. Yeah, there we go. And the last one, this was from a blog that actually appeared on my Twitter feed yesterday. If you want us to reopen, and that means reopen schools, you can't leave your house from now until September. And that's about this huge ethical dilemma at the moment where children are, according to the scientists, not as badly affected as adults by the coronavirus pandemic at the moment, but what about the way in which our staff feel? What about the well-being and mental health of staff going into schools, etc.? And this isn't actually about scaremongering. This is actually about those very real fears, frustrations, and anxieties that staff in schools have about the return to school. Now, these are just some of the really topical issues at the moment, which do bring into focus some very sharply defined ethical decisions for school leaders. There are many, many more, and we'll explore those as we actually go through the session. What I want to do now, just before we get into the session proper, is actually just launch a quick poll just to find out where you are at this point in time in terms of your own focus, or perhaps your awareness of ethical leadership within your own school. So I'm going to launch that poll now. It's a very short question. Has ethical leadership actually been discussed in your governing board? And 3 potential answers there. So if you could cast your vote now, we'd be very, very grateful. If you're having difficulty trying to vote, one option is to minimize your screen if you're in full screen mode, and that very often frees up the voting panel. So just under 80% at the moment, and I've just tipped that now, so I'll give a few more moments for those who haven't voted to do so, and then we'll close that poll down and share those results with you. Okay, that's just about everybody's voted now, so I'm going to close that poll and we'll share those results with you, and that should be up on your screen now. So 27% of you, so just under a third, have said yes, it has been discussed. Almost 60%, so very nearly 2/3 not, and 70% not sure at the moment. That's fine. That's one of the reasons why we, in league with Governors for Schools, actually put this webinar on for you this morning. This is to, our aim is to try and, as we said in the introduction, create a little bit of provocation of thought, so that maybe this is something that should be creeping into our agendas. If not influencing our thinking that goes behind some of the decisions that we and school leaders are actually making in our schools. So However you've answered that question, whatever your feelings about this are at the moment, our ambition is to perhaps prompt you to think about how this does have application in board meetings going forward. So thank you for that. I'll hide those results now and we'll move on with the presentation. Okay. I thought it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about the journey and why this has actually come into place. Document on the right-hand side of the screen, they're navigating the educational moral maze. This is the final report of an organisation called, or a body, I should say, rather than an organisation, that was called the Ethical Leadership Commission. The Ethical Leadership Commission was set up at the tail end of 2017 and spent about 18 months thinking about the tablet, discussing it, exploring resources already available, etc. I've put this screenshot of the front cover of the report on just so that you can see on the right-hand side of that particular document all of those organisations which are all involved in leadership of schools and colleges, and their involvement in this does indicate the significance and also the weight of feeling about how important this actually was. The task of the Commission was quite simply defined as to develop ethical principles for education. And I think the documents, we've given you the links for these documents at the end of the PowerPoint, and they are still available to download from the internet, and you can actually read them at your leisure. Document on the left-hand side of the screen is the Association of School and College Leaders. They really took quite a significant lead. As I said, National Association of Head Teachers is there as well, as are other organisations, including the National Government Association. But ASCL took the lead in terms of the publication of this, and the document on the right-hand side of your screen is, again, a report on the Commission, but specifically written with head teachers and other school leaders in mind. So, again, both of those documents I think we would actually recommend as a good starting point if you're motivated to actually find out a little bit more about the subject. Comment or question, sorry, I should say, here has come in from Julia. Julia is saying, does the topic link with the diversity agenda, or should they be regarded as separate issues despite being linked? I think the ethical leadership piece of work here, Julia, is very much part of a number of different agendas within the school landscape at the moment. I think the idea of the ethical leadership framework and setting up these ethical principles is that when we're thinking about diversity, when we're thinking about exclusion, when we're thinking about admissions and many other aspects of school life, we should be perhaps referencing the ethical principles before we start to make pronouncements, before we start to put policies and processes in place. So I see the two as inextricably linked.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I think you'll whilst you might be new to the subject as a board member, you won't be new to some of the underpinning aspects of it. And this is about how, from a moral point of view, you are able to demonstrate in the work that you do as a board that you have embodied these principles in the pieces of work that you are doing. So it very much has implications across a whole range of things, but certainly all of the things that you're suggesting would feed into that journey of, have we made decisions based on the ethical principles underlining the way in which we are required to govern schools. This maybe just helps to think about it in a slightly different way, but you'll see the connections to things that you already know about.
And I think a very good example of that, we've got a question, another question here has come in from Alexandra, and Alexandra's saying, asking, how is finding people who may be fearful of their children returning to school, especially if they've been shielding and then expected to mix with lots of other children, how is that ethical? That's a typical question that I think as governors and as school leaders will be reflected on. I would say, if you want my personal response to that, is there is an ethical dilemma here. Clearly the government has said that the rules on attendance do come back into force at the beginning of the autumn term. However, schools will always be the ones who are making the final decisions over whether they should progress to penalty notices with regards to non-attendance. And most of the advice at the moment that has been given by the National Association of Head Teachers, by Association of School and College Leaders to their members is, that should be done in a way that is sensitive, that is mindful of all of those considerations about well-being, mental health, and other feelings that people may have at this point in time. So, as Linda's just said, absolutely falls bang in the middle of this. That's an ethical dilemma. It's one of those ethical dilemmas that school leaders have to confront every day. And when we get to talk about some of the principles that do form part of this ethical framework going forward, you'll see hopefully that a lot of them do apply absolutely to that particular question at this point in time. Ruth has actually got a question here. Are questions raised anonymously given some ethical points may be raised? Ruth, just as a courtesy, I don't give people's surnames out anyway, but just as a courtesy, I normally mention the first name. If you would like to put a question and you don't want your name, then just mention that in the question, and I can assure you I won't do that. Mustafa's just said, can we provide links to the two publications? Yes, absolutely. They're on the penultimate slide, Mustafa, so you'll find those at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay, so let's just move on at that point. Again, just a couple of overview slides really in terms of the ethical framework. This is a quote taken directly from the publication that was featured on the right-hand side of the previous slide, called Navigating the Educational Moral Maze. And I think this is quite helpful because this does put it into a little bit of context. School and college leaders face ethical dilemmas every day, but have never had an agreed framework that enables us to explore and test these dilemmas against ethical principles. And again, going back to Alexandra's question a few moments ago about attendance and potential fining of people, that sits very, very neatly within this particular paragraph here, doesn't it? Really, and of course, don't forget when it says school and college leaders there. That means us as governors as well. The National Governors Association, very much part of the commission, and governors are regarded as part of school leaders. We may be unpaid, we might be volunteers in our roles, but we are part of school leadership, and I think that's really important to actually recognise that we are part of this as well. Sorry, Linda.
Well, a really good example, I think, that Alexandra gave us to apply that principle to, because the other issue here is that not all children will have come from the same background context, and it may be a completely different decision that will be made, not a generic decision about all children. And again, this takes us deeper into this moral dilemma. How are you fair, but also you want children to be at school and learning and having an opportunity, and there will be a whole range of different reasons why children are not necessarily back or wanting to be back or comfortable to be back at school full-time in September, not only the one that relates to children who have been shielding and then expected to mix with lots of other children. So it deepens the practice, the operational practice of applying ethical principles across a range of different people, and that is something that we're hoping to explore and help you reflect on and think about throughout the rest of this presentation.
And I think that idea of reflection is absolutely crucial to this, because of course what the framework doesn't do is actually give you the answers. What the framework is intended to do is to encourage us all to perhaps explore the thinking behind some of these dilemmas, and that's why they're called dilemmas, some of these dilemmas, before we actually jump perhaps to conclusion or jump to giving a reaction that perhaps may not sit comfortably within the ethical stance that we would prefer to take. Really good example of that, Amanda's just put a question up. At the moment, breakfast and after school clubs are not allowed. If that's the same in September, should governors' schools do something to enable school attendance and parents who need to go to work? That's a perfect example, Amanda. I'm not going to answer the question because it's not for me to answer, because the circumstances, the context of your school will be different from mine and different from Linda's and everybody else's on the webinar today. But what we should be thinking about is balancing the considerations and thinking about this from an ethical standpoint. So yes, absolutely, we want to do the best by those parents that work, but we also want to do the best for the health and the well-being of all members of the school community, pupils and staff alike. And therefore, it's not an easy yes or no, but what we should be doing, rather than just jumping to an answer that says, no, it puts us at risk, think about all of the elements that actually influence that decision, and think about, are there a number of ways around that where we could perhaps take a slightly more ethical stance, doing the right, ethical makes it sound rather grand, doesn't it? I mean, what we're talking about here is doing the right thing for as many members of our school community as we possibly can. And there will be lots of other factors influencing that decision. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. So as far as the development of this is concerned, as we say, this is not new. This was launched last year, and a lot of schools joined what was referred to as a Pathfinder project, which was asking school leaders, and again, including us as governors. This was championed by the ASCL and the National Governance Association at the time, and what they wanted was a number of schools to volunteer to actually be part of this project. And that involved making a very firm commitment to the framework, but specifically looking at the two questions represented in these bullet points here. First one, how well do school leaders actually fulfill their roles as trusted educators? And I think I would suggest the key word there is trusted. Secondly, what kind of role models are we to the children in our care? So again, that's something very much about doing the right thing. It's about the practice what you preach, being seen to be modeling, personifying all of those characteristics, all of those elements of acceptable behaviours that we would want to see reflected in our children and young people in our schools. And there are several hundred schools up and down the country represented in that. And if you go onto the National Governance Association website, there's actually a little interactive map that does highlight some of them. There are some case studies on their website now as well. Okay, let's just move on to the next slide. So in terms of the context of this, what does it mean? How do we go about thinking about whether we in our individual governing boards meet this description of having ethical governance, having ethical leadership in place? Well, a very good starting point I would suggest for us is to think about, first and foremost, the fact that as individuals involved in governance, whether that's in an academy trust or actually in a maintained school, we are holders of public office. Might be unpaid public office, as we said before, but nonetheless, governance is public office. And therefore, as governors, we are bound by the principles of public life. Principles of public life, often referred to as the Noland Principles, were commissioned by John Major's government back in the late 90s, and the report was submitted to the Committee on Standards in Public Life that was actually finally published in 2008. But this is supposed to be the framework by anybody holding public office conducts themselves, and the principles that you can see represented on the cover of the document that I've got on the left-hand side of the screen at the moment there. Accountability absolutely is what we're all about as governors. We are accountable for the effective learning and the effective care in all of our educational institutions. That first and foremost is our remit. That's what we're all about, and we are responsible for the effective delivery of those elements of education. Selflessness, we are there for the pupils, for the children and young people in our schools. There shouldn't be any ulterior motive here. Integrity, I guess, for me, is the one that is very often perhaps compromised when governing bodies actually get into difficulty for whatever reason. And Linda and me in our day jobs, what we often find where we're actually dealing with when governance has actually gone wrong, very often integrity is the one principle, the one quality that perhaps has actually been let slip. And there I'm thinking about things like declarations of interest, always being seen to act in the best interest of the children rather than any ulterior motive that we might have for ourselves. Objectivity. Sorry, Linda.
I was just going to reference back to the last bullet point on your previous slide. For me, this comment what kind of role models are we to the children in our care, really sits underneath that integrity. If we are modelling the kind of people that we in public office that we expect our young people to aspire to be themselves, we have to demonstrate those principles to them. And most of us as board members will have signed something which is usually called a code of conduct, which embodies these principles and maybe interprets them a little bit more around your governance functions. And you'll probably be the one you'll be most aware of as a new governor would be that idea of confidentiality built into this integrity. And I think that it is from this point on that we start to see ourselves in a slightly different way, because it's not only coming to meetings. I know we're not doing that at the moment. It's not only the work that we do in school, but it's also the way we conduct ourselves in other areas of our lives where children, parents and the community might know that we are a board member and therefore are holding us to a slightly higher standard than they maybe would hold themselves. But we have an influence as board members to do the right thing, and that is embodying integrity in the way in which we live our lives generally, as well as a governor.
And that leads quite nicely. We've got a question here from Liz. Forgive me, Liz, it's a rather long question, so I'll paraphrase it if I may. Basically, the gist of Liz's question is one of the biggest issues in school at the moment is, in education at the moment rather, is those schools who are sometimes seen to offload pupils or perhaps even turn pupils away because of their very specific needs. And I think that comes to the heart of this, doesn't it? And what Linda's just said about integrity, absolutely that. Integrity is about doing the right thing and being seen to do the right thing. And of course, none of these principles that we're talking about here stand alone. You know, integrity is absolutely inextricably linked with openness and honesty as well. And actually, I think probably all of us do know schools where we're aware that, oh, well, we probably can't meet the needs of your child here. Have you thought about such and such a school down the road? They've got a much better reputation of dealing with children with special educational needs or dealing with the sort of difficulties your child's got, etc. Now, I think we're aware of the emphasis that Ofsted was putting off rolling last year. That was meant to actually look into some of those issues, but those issues start in our schools. What we should be seeking as governors is that assurance from school leaders that we are not turning pupils away. We are actually opening our doors to all schools, because education should be inclusive. It should be about meeting the needs of all pupils. So I think it's a really good point made, Liz, and I think the question for all of us is, do we know for sure? Are we asking those questions in our own schools? You know, that can confirm that there is not an amount of, but a hugely significant proportion of integrity used in all aspects of school life, and attendance and exclusion very much part of that. We'll come back to that a little bit later. A comment from Chris here I'd just like to read out, because I think this one's actually probably applies to quite a few people. Chris is saying, just a quick reflection, having voted no in the poll, and no to has ethical leadership been on the agenda for the board, I'm now reassured, looking at the current slide, that we have been considering a lot of ethical issues, even though we haven't formally had ethical leadership on the agenda. And I think that's a point really well made, Chris. And an awful lot of us will refer to the Noland Principles, hopefully, and hopefully use that as a guiding light for us. Sorry, Linda.
That was just, I hesitated to make that point at the end of the poll, because I felt that you would see the connections as we moved forward in the slide presentation to the things that in your code of conduct you are probably familiar with in terms of words on a page, and this is just now looking at this in the wider context and applying these principles maybe in a deeper way against some of the questions, very good questions, very deep questions around, well, I may not be able to change things in other schools, but can I be sure as a board member that outside criticism couldn't level the same comments about our school? So it's about making step by step, not a revolution, but an evolution of is there more ethical steps that we can take together as a leadership team in the school to make our school a more ethically based education establishment.
Yeah, and I think that links to another question we've got here from Alexandra. Alexandra saying, how do we balance things that we know as a parent with being a parent governor and maintaining integrity? We naturally want to advocate for our children, but bringing things up in a governing board is not the right place. Absolutely, it's not, Alexandra. And of course, the one thing that Linda and I would always stress to all parent governors is we are there as a representative member. We're not a representative or a delegate of parents. We are there as a representative member of the group of all parents, and therefore we should be there for all pupils and not our own. There will always be, or there should always be, route, if we've got concerns for our own children, a route to follow there in terms of raising those concerns. But you're right, the governing body isn't the place to do that. I think if we're talking about balancing out that knowledge that we might have as a parent with what we're being told in governing bodies, that's a perfectly valid reason. Again, one doesn't want to get sort of too involved in our own individual details here, but you know, if you know something as a parent and you're being told something to the contrary, it is perfectly acceptable to actually make that comment. It's not about putting your child out there on a pinnacle in the governing body to be discussed. It's saying, well, actually, that's not my experience. And that's a perfectly reasonable comment, and there's lots of questions we could ask actually around that. I'm not going to go through the rest of these Noland Principles here, because I think hopefully you'll actually appreciate, as I said a few moments ago, many of them are interlinked. Leadership, of course, is actually that one about being seen to do the right thing. It is about role modeling, and it is about the fact that, you know, leadership within schools should be respected, should be looked up to, and it's imperative that all of us ensure that we're doing the right thing so that is the case. And that requires all of these qualities of selflessness, integrity, openness and honesty, etc. as well. And I think for us as governors, we should always remember our role as guardians of our schools in the longer term. And therefore it should be imperative for all of us to ensure that these are actually up there, alive and being breathed on a day-to-day basis. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide now, and this is taking us a little bit further into the framework, and this is specifically, so we've got the Noland Principles which underpin hopefully all of us in public office as governors. These are the principles which the Commission has actually set up, characteristics, I should say, which the Commission has set up, which they are saying that all of us as leaders in schools, again, including us as governors, should be reflecting in terms of the way we conduct ourselves, the way we actually make our decisions, the way in which we are shaping our schools, and therefore through doing that shaping children, young people as well. So starting from left to right, we've got trust here. Of course, you know, what we do want is leaders who are reliable and trustworthy and also honest. So, you know, the idea of truth is actually quite significant. And we want people to be truthful. We want them to have principles. And again, you can see how this links back into you know, the Noland framework as well, because there's a very real crossover here into concepts such as integrity. We've got wisdom there, and wisdom, of course, is about head teachers and other school leaders using their experience and their knowledge, but of course tempered with the idea that there should be some moderation and self-awareness here as well. So it's not the ivory tower leadership, it's very much leading a community that is made up of staff and of pupils, and ensuring that we're always doing the right thing for them. Kindness is the next one of those principles. Kindness is defined in the framework as respect and generosity of spirit. So it's about really recognizing that sometimes there are some very difficult decisions to be made in school leadership. There's some very difficult messages at times to be conveyed to individuals, but it's about how we do that, always being fair, but always actually doing it from a position of humanity. We then get into justice. Justice, again, is about fairness, of course. It's about, again, recognizing that we are there working for all children, young people in our schools, not just for those that are going to bring the best results to the school, those who are going to bring the best enhancements to the school reputation, etc. But schools are there very much as a service, which of course takes us into the next one. It's a service for all members of the community. And this comes back to some of those questions we've already had had about our policies, but also our practices and what we do perhaps behind the scenes with regard to admissions, exclusions, special educational needs, etc. Again, schools are there to serve their communities, and as governors, we are the ones who are the guardians of those principles and moralities, the ethics behind this, to ensure that actually that's what's happening on a day-to-day basis in our school. Courage, an incredibly important one, but of course courage is actually about doing the things that are right, even sometimes against quite a difficult backdrop for all pupils. And again, coming back to the question that was asked a few minutes back about after-school clubs, breakfast clubs, etc. Yes, we want to do the right thing for those parents who are working. That's an integral part of getting the economy back on its feet again. But sometimes head teachers, sometimes school leaders have to have the courage to say it's not right to do that at this point in time, because the bigger consideration here, the bigger part of the balance scales has to be putting the health and well-being of the school community first. So sometimes there are difficult messages to be conveyed, but actually our leaders as governors will be supporting those messages. We're there to actually, hold the schools to account, to ensure that we're doing the right things, but to actually do that courageously. And of course, last but by no means least, that concept of optimism, that and optimism really is a virtue, isn't it? This is the idea that our school leaders, we want them to be positive, we want them to be encouraging on an ongoing basis, and to think that actually what we're doing, and again there was the phrase "the moral imperative" was used probably during the coalition government more than at this current point in time, but that's something that's been hijacked a little bit in my personal view. But actually there is something about morality here, there is something ethical that says schools are about trying to make the world a better place, and one little bit at a time, one pupil at a time, one act of kindness, a little bit of wisdom and trust at a time, all of those things make our schools optimistic in their outlook. We should always be looking for the best in individuals, and we should be thinking about the difference that actually makes to the lives of individuals, but to the lives of all of those young people who are going to grow up and inherit our society from us. So hopefully you can see that those 7 characteristics or virtues there do put a little bit more meat on the bones that perhaps the Noland Principles give us, but actually do relate to the reality of life in school on a day-to-day basis.
And
now, we've got quite a few. Sorry, Linda, carry on.
For each of these areas, there needs to be some knowledge behind it. And I think as governors, we all need to understand and gain some knowledge about our school, what good governance means. And that knowledge then allows us to interact with these ethical principles or characteristics in order to exercise courage. So if we're working on something that is quite a courageous project or quite a courageous approach with our school or academy, we need to build some knowledge around that so that we understand what we're being asked to do and we can move forward with courage. If we think about our current situation with the full opening of schools in September, there has been some very important decisions that have had to be taken. Some of them are reflected in the questions that we've had so far, but having undertaken a risk assessment as a school, having had that oversight and developed our understanding as a board, then we move forward with optimism as a whole school community, with the belief and the knowledge that we have done the very best that we can to ensure that we have a positive start to a new academic year, and that we take into account our children's needs across a whole spectrum of the curriculum and their well-being, and we move forward with a strong plan about how we can make this better in the future. So all of these things fit together. It doesn't matter where you start, you can apply some of those principles if you know the plan, you're optimistic about the future, you're dealing in a kind way and a just way with those pupils who may be reluctant to return to school or face other challenges about returning to school, then these things all start to fit together into that ethical approach.
And Chris has put a comment on here, which I think is actually probably reflects maybe a number of people in the audience today. Chris is saying, a quick thought on your last comment about courage, i.e. balancing the needs of economy versus health and safety of a school community. Chris's board voiced the view that they should fully back the principle of putting health and safety first, despite the steer from the Department for Education being in a different direction. And that's a very good example. Again, when we pose that question in the poll at the beginning, you don't have to have ethical leadership on the agenda to demonstrate an ethical stance here. It's about doing the right thing for your community. Now, we're all part of the broader community, which is England, which is the UK at the moment, and of course we all want to see the economy back on its feet, but not at all costs, probably. I don't want to get into a political debate here this morning. That's not what this is about. But there are some compliance issues. That's part of a separate role of governance here. But this is actually this isn't talking about non-compliance. This is actually saying, okay, what are the other implications of the decisions we may be making here? And you're absolutely right, Chris. Government guidance is just that. It's guidance. It's not law on these issues. Therefore, it's not a question of compliance at all. It's a question of doing the right thing, which of course is, the core of everything that we're talking about here this morning. So thank you for that comment, Chris. We've got a couple of other questions come through here. Natalie's asking the question, how do we ethically address the Black Lives Matter movement within our school communities and ensure that we include all cultures, and ensure that we include all cultures and that they are embraced? I think that's a very good question to pose, Natalie. Again, I think with reference to some of these principles, some of the Noland Principles, there's some legislation here. So integrity in doing the right thing and ensuring that we are respecting equalities legislation is just a starting point. But I think the ethical framework here is a perfect way of actually reflecting on some of those issues and the anti-racism, Black Lives Matters agenda. Do we have the trust of our community? Are we using the experience and knowledge that we've got? Is that sufficient? If not, do we go and find more? But are we acting in a way that's kind and courageous? Are we actually displaying that optimism that we want a better life for all members of our community? So I think these are very helpful ways in which that question and perhaps a lot of other similar questions can actually be decided. Sam's put a question up here saying, who decides when any of the public life standards are not being met by some governors due to age? I think I would suggest that whatever you think the cause of people not actually abiding by those standards are, hopefully all of us have a code of conduct in our governing bodies. We should, it's the right thing to do. And if we feel that the code of conduct, which in my view, and I think Linda would probably concur hopefully with me on this, all codes of conduct should reflect those Noland Principles now anyway. It is our duty as governors. We've signed up to the code of conduct, and if we think there are individuals or groups of individuals on our boards who are not living those principles, our role is to actually hold them accountable. We should hold ourselves accountable, but we should hold others accountable. So we shouldn't be afraid. And again, we should display the courage to say, well, hang on a minute, how does that sit with the Noland Principles? If you're having a conversation in the governing board, and hopefully you won't be, but this does happen in some schools, that yes, we've actually excluded 3 pupils this month, we couldn't meet their needs, and therefore it's the right thing to do. Do we just accept that? You look at the code of conduct on exclusions, you can't ever exclude a pupil because you don't believe that you're the right setting for them. It's about what we do in terms of adaptations, it's about what we do to secure the right care. So there are some very real ethical questions at the root of that, and we shouldn't be accepting these. And if we do feel, and I think it's a good question to ask, Sam, if we do feel that those standards are being compromised, then we should actually ask the question about that.
I've looked at that question in a slightly different way, Steve. So what I've reflected on, having worked with governors for a long time, that sometimes people stay on a board because they are loyal to a school, but they are not moving with the times. And I'm trying to be as kind here, because what I think we are looking at is, how I'm interpreting the question, is that there are sometimes where a board where people have been set in a way, or they have reached a point where they need to be celebrated for their service, and allowed to step down. And sometimes people stay on a board because they're being loyal to the organisation. But whatever it is, whatever the reason, we have to apply these ethical principles. Do we know that as a board we have offered training opportunities, that we have encouraged and supported people to learn and to think differently as time has passed? Are we sure we have done everything as a board that we can? And then we need to act with justice and kindness. So if they can't be supported to a different view, or they have reached the point where actually we should celebrate their service and allow them to step down, then we need to unpick with knowledge what it is that sits behind someone or a group of people not acting in the way that we would expect, and reflect first about, have we done enough to take them on that journey to where we expect them to be.
Absolutely. So I hope we've actually responded from all angles on that, Sam. Another question here from Inam. Inam is actually saying, how many governors encourage deeper inclusivity in school leadership for historically underrepresented groups? Again, I think we need to think about lots of issues there, and governors should be asking those questions. We should be asking how representative we are of our communities. We should be asking how we include all elements of our communities, both from a curriculum perspective, both from a pastoral care perspective, and perhaps even representation in governance is something we should think about. But yeah, if we don't ask those questions from an ethical perspective, Inan, then nobody else will. So I think you're absolutely right to get us to actually reflect on that.
And I think your comment about engagement with parents is hugely important, and it's one which has gathered traction over the last few years in terms of our governance. Are we confident that the school is engaging with the school community appropriately? This isn't just about newsletters and surveys, it is about understanding the context. And if we've got underrepresented groups, or we've got groups that do less well as children in terms of achievement, the parents are less likely to be well prepared to be governors, to even consider stepping up. So there is a gap between what we do with engagement to encourage and support parents' understanding of the education system and their engagement with it, whatever their background, and then to reflect what we've understood by that as a school or an academy in the decisions that we make as a governing body. Ultimately, the aspiration is to have a reflective board that includes a similar proportion of people from a wide ethnicity and indeed economic perspective as possible, but we need to build the blocks for them to be able to make that journey. I have seen, sadly, a couple of people who were encouraged to step up, and they found it so overwhelming that actually it wasn't the supportive and inclusive activity that their boards hoped it would be. So it is about building those steps, that engagement, inclusion in a complete way across the whole school community.
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of questions coming through on that issue of representation linked to Black Lives Matters, etc. Thank you, Valerie. Valerie's put a very nice comment on. There was an excellent webinar last week raising awareness of anti-racism. So if you didn't take part in that webinar last week, folks, and you'd like to look at it, the recording is available on the Governors for Schools website. So please do have a look at that. Going to actually move on now, because I think I just want to think about some of those areas perhaps in school life where ethical leadership ought to perhaps be something to consider for us in our individual schools or trusts. And this covers we've got a lot of questions sitting on the board at the moment, which I will group together in a few moments, but just wanted to put this slide up first just to actually raise some of the areas where Linda and I believe that the conversations about what's the right thing to do here, which is what we're talking about, of course. Admissions is an obvious one, and we've had a number of questions on admissions, and I'm going to come back to some of those in a few moments. But Are we confident, as we said before, that we're not turning pupils away because we don't think that we can meet their needs, or actually we think they might be difficult, they might be quite challenging for us? Or are we a school that is truly inclusive and open to all? Similarly, the flip side of that, what's our track record on exclusions? And when governors sit on exclusion panels, and sometimes they might be involved in review panels as well, are we truly looking at it independently, or do somewhere in the back of our minds we have that thought, well, we don't want to let our head teacher down or our principal down by voting against them? Actually, that's a huge ethical dilemma, and that's one that we should always come down with. Doing the right thing should be doing the right thing for the pupil. It should not be about blindly supporting head teachers. I have no doubt at all that the vast majority of our head teachers will have done the right thing, will have followed the procedures, will have followed the code of conduct. But I've come across far too many governors in my time who say, well, we can't possibly vote against the head teacher. That's almost like a vote of no confidence, isn't it? Well, actually, no, it's not. If we're coming at this from a position of integrity, what we should be saying is the school has not followed, it's not a personal thing, this is a professional thing, the school has not followed its own procedures, it has not followed the statutory framework, therefore it doesn't matter how justified or otherwise we may think this, the process is flawed, therefore we shouldn't support and uphold it. Recruitment, and again this touches some of those issues that we've just been discussing now. How open and honest and transparent are we in our recruitment processes? And that would include internal promotion as well. And there are all sorts of connotations here in terms of all of the protected characteristics under the Equalities Act. We've touched on curriculum design already. Does the curriculum get designed to meet the needs of all pupils? An ethical dilemma in certainly one of the schools where I'm a governor has been government policy is absolutely nailed to the post of the English Baccalaureate. This is something all pupils should be persuaded to do. I personally, I have a standpoint that says I don't think that's right for a significant proportion of the pupils in my school who historically have ended up, and I have but no doubt will do going forward, in occupations in employment that does not need them to have triple science and a modern foreign language, etc. But they want to do media studies, they want to do communication studies and film studies, they want to do subjects that will actually enable them to actually get a job that they want that better meets their needs. Now, there's a very tricky balancing line there, but we have to think about, well, what is the intent behind our curriculum? Is the intent behind our curriculum to nail it to government policy? And again, I'm not talking about non-compliance here, this is policy rather than legislation. Or is it to do what we think is in the best interest of our pupils and our school community? There's no easy answer there, but they are questions nonetheless that I do believe we should be perhaps reflecting on. When we're making pay decisions, are they made with the idea of an ethical, a moral and honest standpoint in the back of them, or are they made on affordability? Or are they made, perhaps in the light of, we're getting some feedback that this isn't a team player, this is somebody who perhaps doesn't really fit in our school, and we don't want to encourage them to stay by being too generous with pay awards. When we're thinking about tenders and contracts, where does integrity sit there? Where does financial probity sit? Have we always explored that we're doing the right thing in terms of making sure everybody has declared interest, etc.? Or have we got instances where, well, actually, I know somebody who's done a really good job here, and actually we should be going to, they're reasonably cheap, they're good value, but actually it's an easier route. Anything that we do financially has to be subject to the rules of probity, which again just means doing the right thing and sits very much within the ethical framework here. And that wider point about declarations of interest and conflicts of interest, I've been involved in 2 meetings this week about some disputes, is probably the best way of putting it, in schools, both of which revolved around the idea that conflicts of interest had not been declared because they weren't even recognised as being conflicts. One of the issues for us as far as conflict of interest is concerned is it's very much about perception. Sometimes it's more about perception than it is about reality. It's not about whether there is a conflict, it's about would people perceive it as a conflict. And again, if we're thinking about those Noland Principles, if we're thinking about the characteristics within the framework, these are things that we ought to be taking quite a high moral stance on, and actually reflecting on the question, well, what would other people think about this? How would this look to the outside world? And of course, there are many others in our individual schools as well. Just getting conscious that we are running out of time here, but just got a couple of questions which I'd just like to add at this point in time. A couple of questions about faith schools, schools of religious character. How in a faith school do we support diversity in same-sex couples without causing a huge rift, as many on the board can be ministers? That's quite an easy one, to be honest. Several people have asked that question. The law says that the new relationship, sex and health education guidance has to be delivered in schools in all of its elements, and there is something about life in modern Britain is about us all living up, and it's about our children growing up in a diverse culture. And what we have to take account of is that new guidance that says that children now must be taught about what family means in modern Britain. Now, family can mean anything from extended family, children living with their grandparents, one parent, one partner, etc., or it can mean life in a same-sex couple. That is part of life. In a religious community, that may not sit comfortably with any particular faith, but it does not mean that we can ignore it, because it is part of the equalities law in this country, and therefore it is perfectly acceptable to say that, you know, in our faith this is not something that is widely supported, but it doesn't mean you cannot tell children that. Children have the right to grow up to learn about all aspects of our society, and it's very wrong, and it's actually against the statutory framework to do otherwise. Sorry, my mouse is sticking at the moment. Interesting question from Peter here. From what's been said so far, there's an implication of universality in moral judgment. It seems to me the meaning isn't given, but about negotiation of meaning shaped by multiple elements, not least political views and beliefs. I think you're absolutely right, Peter, and hopefully what we've said is that there are no right and wrong answers here. All this is doing is actually hopefully shaping the process by which we come to the decisions that we make, the answers that we give to questions, because there will sometimes be a moral dilemma here, there will sometimes be an ethical dilemma, but ultimately school leaders, including us as governors, have to make the right decision for those pupils, and we need to think of all of those elements of the ethical framework in doing that.
And if we think of diversity in its widest possible context, every board will be very different. And as well as negotiation, which was a word that was mentioned there, I would also use the word influence. Because if we are influencing with integrity, if we are living the principles and we are setting that example in all that we do with kindness, with justice, around a framework that we negotiate with others, then hopefully the way in which we conduct ourselves individually will have a positive influence on other members of the board that may be learning as they go how governance operates, how decisions are made, and how to be supportive whilst not being in absolute agreement with the majority decision that has been reached. So there's a whole range of things there that fit in, but it is about being kind to others, working in a way where you are embodying these principles, you are doing the right things for the right reason, having built some knowledge into your decision making, so that, you know, this is really key to getting some of these things right, is to make sure that you are informed and knowledgeable before you make difficult decisions in any of these areas that this current slide is displaying at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Got quite a few questions here talking about governor's terms of office based on the comment Linda made a few moments ago and how we approach that. Again, I think if we've got people on our board who perhaps we don't feel are maybe in step with where we believe they should be, then obviously one of the things that we could do, I think honesty is appropriate in all of these instances, about being, being frank, being sensitive, of course, with people, but actually governance has changed, governance has moved on in the same way that our society, our communities have moved on, and we have to think about it. And again, Linda's comment about building blocks. How do we build greater understanding in our governing bodies? Well, unless we're prepared to confront some of the barriers to that, we're actually never going to achieve it. So I do think we have to be mindful that it is our responsibility. It comes back to the code of conduct again. We should be challenging underperformance, whatever that looks like in our governance. And sometimes it's a historical perspective that actually leads to that.
And I think one of the areas that boards are not terribly good at doing on the whole, and apologies if you're a member of a board that does this well, is an annual self-evaluation that allows conversations to take place about individuals' approach, performance, if you like. We might not use those stronger words, but holding to account and making sure people have opportunities to develop and be supportive. And on a very anecdotal note, I am somebody who is probably in that upper age bracket, and Steve and I have had some quite frank conversations, and I've said to him clearly, if I get to a stage where you don't think I'm performing as well as I should, please tell me, because I would want to address that. So building relationships where there is openness and an ability to have conversations that are difficult, and also knowing when somebody has done well and has reached that stage where they should be celebrated for their efforts and allowed to step down, or provided with an exit strategy that is appropriate and kind and recognises long service. I do think there should be a limit to how long somebody serves before it's reviewed and reflected on. But again, this needs to be done within the context of your own board and your own locality. Sometimes it's easy to get new governors, and other times it's much more difficult. So you need to look at your own board and your own circumstances, but apply these principles to whatever comes next.
Indeed. And of course, there will be lots of other areas where potential aspects of ethical leadership actually come into play. Couple of questions to perhaps reflect upon there. I won't insult your intelligence by reading those out to you, but certainly I think the penultimate question there, do we as governors champion all pupils? I think is a very good one as a starting point. And I think we should be, all of us, thinking about, well, how could we use this framework? How could we use this concept, perhaps more deeply than we have historically, to ensure that any decisions, any resolutions that we're making in our boards do actually reflect the ethical stance that hopefully all of us actually agree is the right way to go. I'm afraid we haven't really got any time for any more questions. We've run over the witching hour, I'm afraid. So all that remains for me to do is just share this one little stance. And again, I've put the URL for this up on the penultimate slide as well. This is something that was produced by the Standards Board for England. Quite a few local councils have actually reproduced this and shared it. It's an ethical governance toolkit. It's aimed at local councils, but it's well worth actually having a look at. This is talking about corporate governance rather than school governance, but all of the principles are actually embedded in this. And as you'll see on the left-hand side there, there's a light touch health check and a benchmark here. Not all of it's applicable, but a lot of it is. So I would urge anybody, if you're interested in reading more on this subject, that's a very good start point. And so I've given you both of those tools there. But just to say to you then, thank you very much indeed for joining the webinar this morning. Linda and I are delighted to support the work that Governors for Schools is doing, and at Better Governor we are running a series of webinars and have been for quite some time now, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the next one, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you for joining us, and if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments just to fill the very short 4-question questionnaire in before you go, we'd be really grateful. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your day today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Goodbye.